Thank you so much, Michelle, for joining me today on Film and Impact. I'm really happy to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor. I'm really excited to be, sharing the film and stories with you and our, Caribbean sister in Martinique.
Thank you. Well, you've been making films for like quite a while now, and
Oh,
you,
you're making me sound old.
well, very experienced in filmmaking. And you've received like different awards for your films. Your films have received international acclaim. You've had like excellence in filmmaking awards. But you didn't start in film. Like you haven't always made films. How did you get into film, and why did you make this transition?
Yeah, I'm kind of a latecomer to the filmmaking process. I mean, I didn't go to film school, it was kind of like I learned on the ground. But it really comes from my passion. I mean, I've always been interested in the arts, but as you know, as a first generation immigrant to North America, there was always this drive of trying to find some kind of balance and profession that could be sort of secure in some way. But also as the child of a very, political family, leaving Haiti due to a dictatorship. There was always politics and human rights conversations at home. And so I grew up with this sort of passion to certainly try to make a difference in whatever way I could, both connected to my ancestry, but also to the lived experiences I was going through and my family was going through in Canada and the United States, which are the places where I, my formative years were spent. And so I started with wanting to work in international development, and left to work in West Africa with the United Nations Development Program. And I was very disillusioned with the aid industrial complex that existed there. That was not really about, well, for me anyway, it's not really about helping. It's about continuing an extractive process and a different form of colonialism. And I felt like I was part of a keg in a wheel of perpetuating certain systems of oppression. And so I left. I spent about 3 years. I was in Cape Verde, the Cape Verde Islands in West Africa, and decided to pursue law to see if that would be a way for me to do sort of more direct work and see if I could work around, legal frameworks and what could be changed. And, race and examining the racial caste system and colorism, knowing how it impacted my family and also how has that impacted Haiti and the history of the Caribbean has always been near to me, both from an emotional perspective in terms of the intergenerational trauma that we've been through, as families, but also as a collective. And so that was kind of what was driving me as well to do the human rights work, was definitely around looking at race and, and anti-Blackness. And so I came back to New York and went to law school at Columbia. They have a very strong human rights program. And that's when I actually met my partner, who was shifting careers into filmmaking. He is a psychiatrist and was making a shift from that. And he was completely, passionate about storytelling, and felt like there was something in storytelling that we could capture with communities that you couldn't do in a different space. And so he encouraged me to pick up a camera. And so I actually, on one of my internships, I was in Brazil, in Colombia, in Brazil through the Columbia internship program, and was with a Black women's rights organization. And I was kind of doing legal work as an intern by day. And then by evening, I picked up a camera and was doing documentary work with some of their outreach that they were doing with these feminist hip hop artists. And so that was my first taste of kind of picking up the camera and sort of following some of these women who were kind of challenging. At the time, it was gangsta rap was big. That's that's kind of a part of my coming of age around hip hop was from the earlier period. And it just dawned on me at that point that it felt much more fulfilling for me personally to be working in an artistic sphere where I was trying to build narratives that were not being shown. But also there was also this transformative aspect of just a relationship with the women on the other side of the camera, and the process of validation that we were both feeling in the filmmaking process. And so I got the bug and I was like, oh, I'm going to quit law school. And my partner said, no, I don't think so, because I don't come from trust fund. My parents are not, well, my father passed away at the moment, but we didn't grow up with a lot of means. And so I needed to make sure that I had some kind of an economic sort of foundation. So I ended up finishing law school and practicing for a while, but trying to build some sort of economic sort of security. And I started to continue to shoot at that time. So We Choose to Rap was the first very short film that I did coming out of law school. That was from that internship. Then I did another short around this you'd probably be interested in. It's called Playmas. It's a short film about the Caribbean festival here in Brooklyn, the Labor Day parade. And so, which has been part of my culture, like Toronto Caravana, the Montreal, parade, and the New York Labor Day parade are part of my also coming of age. And so I did a piece on that, and then slowly, kind of established a process to do this full time. And so we started our own company about 15 years ago. And I've been dabbling between now teaching actually documentary storytelling and pursuing our own independent film and seeking funding for that. So, and then fast forward is where I am here. So it's a long story, sorry. But what's driven me is looking at the intersection of art and political action, because I feel like art is inherently political. I don't think we can separate that. Whatever our point of view, even if it comes from a political space, we're either challenging or we're supporting, right? And it's something that I really find fulfilling for me, both personally and I think collectively also.
And is this from this point of view that you came to do American Promise, the film that you shot over a period of like 13 years? I think you shot it from like 1999 to 2012, along with your partner, and it was a film that's also received numerous awards. Tell me a little bit about it, and like how you came to do this film. Why was it so important for you to do this film, and like what drove you like through that long period of time, like to just keep going?
Yeah, I think there are a few things that happened at the time, and going back to this idea of needing to sort of balance our desire and passion to tell stories the way we want to tell stories means that you kind of have to also forge your own path, and there's certain other sacrifices you have to make. It means also that the money is not going to come right away necessarily, right? If you believe in your vision. And we also had other jobs at the time. And so when our son was accepted into this private school and was part of this diversity program, we thought it was an opportunity for us to have a project that we could touch base on, that we could continue to shoot over a long period of time, even if we didn't have the money to necessarily, do it in the moment. We knew that over time, even if we kept shooting with our own money out of our pockets, we would have something by the end of the 13 years. And also the idea of access. Documentary film access is everything, right? So what better way to have access than to turn the cameras on ourselves? I also feel like it was an ethical challenge that we were kind of laying down the gauntlet. Is like, if you're able to tell other people's stories, you should be also able and willing to challenge yourself to turn the camera on yourself and your family. And that at times is the hardest thing to do, and to be truthful about it, or at least feel that you're speaking a truth that's not self-indulgent. And so it started very small. What's interesting with the long form, which the longitudinal form is, it's observational, but we're also seeing life evolve. And initially, it was going to be that kindergarten class that our son started in. It wasn't just going to be him. There were 4 other families involved. There was another young Black family, male student, and then there were 3 young women who eventually actually dropped off. One was Latinx, The other was a white young lady who came from an affluent family. And there was another young Black girl who were all in the same class as our son. So it was going to be sort of this almost sociological sort of observation, but then they dropped out, the young women, when they were kind of in fifth grade, the students. And then, you know, we sort of panicked because we had spent time shooting everybody, but realized, you know, after a couple of months that this was going to be and could be even more interesting, that it be focused on a deep dive into the Black male experience in school. So the two boys who were left standing was our son, and then the child of these family friends of ours. And so I guess the motivation was really our love for documentary film, but also an investment in knowing that the longitudinal approach and not necessarily being tied to grants all the time was going to help us tell the story the way we wanted to tell it. And I have to say that it was, you know, by the time we reached, you know, sixth grade with both boys, we realized that we had something really important that we were saying about the Black male experience and how anti-Blackness is experienced in schools, not just in private schools, for young Black men. And so it became sort of this clarion call for us as we started to look for funding, because we said, you know what, we have something really interesting here that's impactful, that talks about a societal issue from a very personal perspective. And we also turned the camera on ourselves as parents and really let our own vulnerabilities and flaws be exposed, because, you know, we don't come with a handbook, parents, you know, and some, you know, we come with our own baggage, but having to deal with these issues that come, how do we protect our son? How do we keep our son whole in this process of schooling? And we got some pushback from foundations, you know, because these were two Black middle class families, you know, with a father and a mother. All of these, both families were working families, you know, we were in Black middle class neighborhoods. And the foundations had these stereotypical perceptions of, well, we don't fund films about, you know, Black families who are doing okay. You know, what do you have to complain about? You know, not seeing that, you know, racism, you know, penetrates all of our class levels. It cuts across class. I mean, and we know that, of course, with the violence that we see with the police brutality that exists. It doesn't matter what, you know, what you make, you know, that does not determine how the police, you know, handle you. It might help later, whatever, if there are, you know, legal issues that you can pay a lawyer, but sometimes it's too late when in terms of how the police treat you. And so we were kind of ahead of the curve in that sense. So the film has really now become a historically relevant film that's part of the canon of understanding the Black experience. We screened it in Martinique and screened it at many different schools there, and it was received, and there was a relevance, you know, understanding that you know, anti-Blackness is global, as we have seen with, you know, the lynching of George Floyd in Minnesota. You know, people have had a call to arms across the globe because of the experiences that they have, you know, felt. I remember when I visited Martinique, you know, the statue of Josephine was beheaded, you know. There were, you know, I don't know if you know about that statue. You probably, you know about the statue. I've taken photographs of it, and it always kind of was ingrained in my mind in that this is a common experience, you know, that we lived through, and the students took it really, you know, to heart. And what they saw in Idris, our son, and Shayon, the other young boy, they saw their lived experiences. I know this is a long answer to your question. You said, oh, why we did American Promise. Yeah, I think it was about trying to have control over our narrative, you know, and not feeling like we needed to be dictated by either a commissioned work necessarily, and that we could maintain our independence. It does mean that, you know, our outpouring of product is not as, you know, as quick as we do commissioned work, of course, but in terms of maintaining our independence for the works that we want to do, there is a level of sacrifice that's involved in that as well.
how did you deal with the pushback from the different foundations when you were looking for funding?
Oh, yeah.
And how long did it take you to actually, gather
Yeah.
funding for the film?
Hmm. Well, this was very key. I'm glad you bring this up because what was interesting about the foundation pushback and how people and how the reaction happened is that the gatekeepers, like the higher ups, were the one giving the pushback, but the program officers that we were involved in themselves were Black or were people of color who saw themselves in this story, right? And by seeing themselves in these stories, because it was their story too, their lived experience growing up, many of them, they knew it was an important story to be told. And so they became our advocates with the white counterparts in these gatekeeping situations who were pushing back. They had an argument to bring to. And I have to say, it was thanks to that kind of, that trail of program officers of color and Black and brown program officers who were our advocates and were able to advocate for us to be able to get funding, which is why it is so important that in these spaces be diverse in the lived experiences, but also that they are able to engage and have a level of power to decide on what stories get told or not. Otherwise, the stereotypes get perpetuated. So you need those lived experiences in the decision-making, boardrooms and spaces. And it was thanks to those advocates that we were able to get the film finished, but also have a very huge and robust sort of community engagement campaign where we went across, the United States, working with high schools, working with teachers, working with parents around this issue. I don't think our career would be where it is if it weren't for the program officers, the Black and brown program officers in these positions of power in those foundations. And they were starting to, it was starting to be more diverse. But it's more than just diversity. It's intentional sort of, it's intentional division of power. It's intentional sort of handing over of power. And we still need to do more of that, on so many levels.
Did it take you very long to garner support for the film?
Yes. So we started sort of early when the boys were sort of in second grade. We got sort of very small local grants in New York City. New York Foundation for the Arts was our first grant. It was small, $5,000. Again, it was a Black male program officer there who saw himself in the story and said, "Oh, we need to support this." And then as we started to get more and more compelling material, because the boys encountered some serious sort of, stereotype threat and prejudice and discrimination when they hit older, when they became sort of more threatening, quote unquote, to teachers who didn't know how to handle them. So we had much more compelling material. And so that's when we started to build packages to different foundations. And then sort of the money started to kind of trickle in little by little by little. And I don't know if it's the same case in France or Martinique or other places in the Caribbean, but in some ways, foundations are a bit like sheep. You have one that starts to support, and then the others just all jump in and start to say, "Oh, this might be a hot product here, so let's see what it's about and support it as well." But the ones who took the risk first, again, were these program officers, and so it took us. The length of it took us all like from, I would say it took us about 7 years to really, we were raising money every year, more and more and more and more. And by the last 2 years, when they said, okay, this film's going to get done, they're almost finished, then people sort of came in to help with finishing, So it's it's a marathon, this process. It's not a sprint. It's about relationships. These are relationships we build over a long period of time. Something else I want to talk about, I feel that's interesting too, is prior to American Promise, we had other films. We had other like Black-centered films that, as you may know already, were supported and heavily kind of like watched by Black communities, global Black communities across the country. You know, there was a time when there were Black film festivals, you know, all over the world that we were traveling to, whether it was, you know, Uruguay, you know, or, you know, Italy, France had Racine Noire. There was like this community, and we knew each other, right? And so we were making films, getting, you know, a certain level of support, but we had this circuit that we were in. And American Promise was kind of this breakthrough sort of film that came out of that space into a large, sort of more mainstream audience. But it's so interesting that once you hit that mainstream, you know, people in that community thought this was our first film, you know, and it was like, wait, hold on, we have a whole other career here that led us to this, that gave us the skill set to be able to tell what we're telling. But for you, it's invisible, right? That space is invisible.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to, I hope today, like things like what are going on with the uprisings and all of that, is how do we ensure, not just validate, for me it's already validated. For me, the validation, what's important is I'm doing films for the communities that I feel closest to, right? Which is, I am the audience. I am the first audience. I have to like what I'm doing. I have to like what that final product is, right? And so, but I know there are other people like me, you know, other people in my community and slightly beyond who find, you know, a space, who find resilience in seeing themselves reflected. So how do we validate those audiences and keep sort of this other network and circuit going that can be revenue generating, right? As opposed to depending on knocking on the door for white audiences to let us into a toxic space that doesn't validate us, you know? So, and it's hard, but the question is, how do we, you know, how do we ensure that? How are we able to figuring out a way? I think this is a crucial moment for us to think about. I guess the word we talk about is self-determination. You know, people talk about self-determination and, you know, in Black-owned businesses, self-determination around, you know, even schools and education. Well, how can we envision or reimagine, you know, self-determination around making our films for our audiences, you know, that allows us maybe to feel stronger, to fight whatever white supremacist oppression that exists outside of our spaces, as opposed to keeping on begging about inclusion, let me in, we are human beings, you know? It's like, I don't need to be reinforced that I'm a human being. I know I'm a human being. I know that people in my community are human beings. Let's talk about the healing. Let's talk about what we're, you know, facing. So that is the challenge, I think, right now. And you know, post-uprising, this post-global uprising, what kind of narratives are we going to tell? What narratives do we want to tell, and what audiences do we want to tell about, you know? It's like that film, I saw that recently, Cuties, which is Mignonne, right?
Yes.
Which I loved. I really loved that film, you know? But you think about all these other impressions about, you know, I don't know how you feel about it. I'm just like, whatever, I saw it and I was like, you know, this is, it's so, there's a cultural specificity to it, that for me, there was something there that I connected to, that I understood, that didn't need translation. You know what I mean? That didn't need translation or acceptance in that way. And that I could sort of understand, sort of feel what she's going through, right? In terms of the push and pull of, you know, of what was going on at home versus the exterior. And to see the craziness around how it's been received by different audiences is just, I feel like it just misses the point, you know? And I know, so it's interesting, you know? I kind of rambled on, sorry.
No, you hit on like so many really important, like relevant points. You said something earlier when you spoke about looking for funding for American Promise, and you said, like, you know, the pushback you got from the foundations who were basically saying, you know, you're not like this poor family, you're like a middle class family. Like, what issues do you have to even talk about? Like, what do you have to complain about? As if in order to make a film that was worth seeing or worth funding, it had to be something that came from an area of darkness, but or, you know, something that had to do with strife or poverty, or, you know, something that said, I'm down here and I'm going to tell a story about it. Not just, this is my life, whatever it is. it's worth talking about. I have a story to tell. And it's an issue that we face, in the Caribbean also. I know that from experience and having like pitched projects and like having looked for like financing for different film projects, uh, you get in the beginning, we did not know exactly what it was, and we eventually deciphered. Like what it was that the stories were not right enough. The stories did not fit the image that they had of the Caribbean. The image that, these funders that were in either European or American spaces that they had of the Caribbean was this paradisiac, location. And basically, the idea is like, what do you have to complain about? Like, you live in this wonderful place. If you're not coming to us with a story that's, about misery, it's not. How would I say that now? It's not going to sell. Our audiences don't want to see this story. So it's either has to do something that's probably like about music or reggae, or it's going to be something that's about poverty or misery, something that fits the idea and the image and the representation that we already have of the Caribbean. But if you just come into us with some, observational style, experimental documentary about whatever subject that you find is so passionate, and we're not very interested in that. So eventually we figured out that, and by we I mean Stephanie Saxena and myself, we figured out that one of the things that we had to do was just tell the stories that we wanted to tell, regardless of, and not try to fit any criteria that was given by these funders. And accept that the stories that we want to tell, they're important because they're all stories, full stop. And that's enough for us. And the other thing is, we realized that we needed to connect with ourselves, and we needed to connect with other people who looked like us, other people who had stories like ours to tell. And in connecting with these people, we were joining forces in a way and slowly creating like the spaces and the platforms where these stories would be told more and more until their presence became undeniable. And whether people in like Europe or elsewhere wanted to see them, they could no longer deny that they existed, and the people who needed to see them, which would be our people, they would see them. And they could also understand that what they used to consuming, like off the television or of streaming networks, etc., it's not the only type of stories that exist. That their stories and the lives that they live and the experiences that they have, they're just as valid, and they can also be on screen just like the stories that we see, being told by other people. And I think one of the things that definitely irks me and always irks me is when filmmakers from other places, they go to these countries, like Caribbean countries, and then they tell stories, because I have seen this kind of stories. And I'm definitely not saying that filmmakers should never go to another country to tell a story at all, but it's often in that sense. It often goes in this direction where they receive funding because they have access to it. And then they go to these places and then they tell the stories of the people who are there, but from their perspective. So, it's always very one-sided. So it's something that's like, and it just like rubs me like the wrong way. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
You can tell other people's stories, but you have to be aware of what's at stake when you do that, and how your perspective colors the story, and how you represent the people's realities. And you need
it's yeah.
Show that in some way. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's deeply extractive. I call it colonial. It's colonial in nature, right? Because you come with your perspective, your colonial perspective, on what stories are important. And again, you can't avoid that you are your first audience. There's no doubt, right? Whether you're European, American, white, Caribbean, whatever, it's your perspective, right? The question is, that white perspective has dominated all of our stories, right? We have not had the opportunity to see other perspectives on our stories. And they are their first audience, right? So it'll be people like them that they will be appealing to in terms of what they watch. Yes. And in terms of what we all watch and what's fed to us as well and what we internalize. So, it's really time to break that up. And, when the interesting thing about observational documentary film is it's always been extractive. You go to the very first ones that in the early 1920s of Nanook of the North, that was all staged work by Flaherty with these Inuit community that were not even living the way he was showing it. He made them, into these stereotypes, that they didn't go hunting, for whales. I mean, they probably knew the tradition, but that they had already been removed from that tradition and were living in other situations. And he staged that, even the igloos and all of that. And, made a fortune too with all this paraphernalia around that. Understanding what that root is, we understand too that documentary has a neocolonial lens that we need to challenge, the nonfiction space. And yeah, I understand it's not so much, sure, you can come and make films about the communities that you're not a part of, but there's got to be a higher accountability to that. How are you being intentional in terms of your crew? How are you being intentional in terms of who's giving you feedback on your creation, on your work, and how do you ensure, that your story, that your story doesn't perpetuate sort of a status quo perception that keeps people oppressed, and gives kind of full life to an agency, to the protagonists that are in, your film. I mean, I take even the example of, Stateless, Apatride, that's will be screening in Martinique. That too is a full. Oh yeah, really, because that film is also it's a fully, Black female Caribbean film behind the camera. Our producers are Trinidadian Canadian, Jamaican Canadian, and then myself, Haitian Canadian, behind the camera. And so is, and the directors of photography are, from the Caribbean as well. It's a fully sort of, it's a Caribbean point of view. It's, a diasporic point of view, of course, because we all grew up in North America, but our roots are in the Caribbean. And I'm sure that it's affected the way you see our protagonists, whether it's Rosairis or the ultranationalist Gladys or even Teofilo, but also that it's female-centered. The main protagonists are female. Someone like Rosairis is an educated, Dominican woman of Haitian descent who grew up in the sugarcane fields, but has kind of risen above her status with the education that she was able to fight for. And I'm not saying that somebody else would not have, but we were very intentional in thinking about how do we counter stereotypes, how do we tell the story in a way that provides agency and that feels. I don't like to use the word empowered because we all have power. It's about how are we able to access the power that we already have, but how do we do that with the understanding that the systemic is there and it's very oppressive. But can we, how do we navigate that? How do people navigate that on a day-to-day that can be inspiring and relatable too at the same time?
Just concerning us, Stateless, first of all, what brought you to make this film? And is it part now that it's done? It was released early 2020. Is it part of a campaign, of an impact campaign or engagement campaign of any kind?
Well, interestingly, like back in 2013, 2014, I was actually just coming out of American Parmis, and we had done like the film came out in 2013, and we had done almost 2 years. We had actually started before the film ended our own community engagement work with the film, and we were just sort of on the tail end of that campaign, sort of kind of winding down, and we're thinking about what our next project was going to be. And then the decision came down in the DR by the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, in September of 2013. And the extreme act of what I call state sanctioned is a form of genocide to render over 200,000 people invisible because of their blackness it's a modern form of genocide. You don't have to pick up a gun or a machete to commit acts of violence. And so when that happened, we thought about it, and I said, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to kind of go back to the island where my ancestors are from, and where I, grew up, not on one part of the island, and explore what's going on down there from this diasporic lens. And so 6 months later, I had a little bit of funding from the Black Public Media, which is a public fund by the federal government that gives money to filmmakers, Black filmmakers, to do their independent films. We had a little bit of funding, and I went there for a first research trip, and connected with people that actually I knew from before, because I had done a series of shorts around the Haitian earthquake that happened in Haiti, and there were some pieces that I had done around Dominican Haitian collaboration around the earthquake with young people, and I reconnected with them, and they led me to some of the organizations that eventually introduced me to Rosairis, the main protagonist there. And so it just spending time down there, I felt like, yeah, this is I want to be able to tell the story. And for me, what was really important, I connected to it not just as a woman from the Haitian diaspora, but also as an immigrant myself in North America, where our family sort of suffered, different types of discrimination around housing and work, my parents especially, and being witness to that and experiencing also that personally in schools, feeling that connection. And also kind of a little bit of selfish thing, being able to spend some time on the island doing work, where that was not just about visiting family, but being there and getting to know the island from a different angle as somebody who didn't grow up there. So that's that, fast forward 5 years later, and, Stateless kind of came out of that. And, when I decided, I hadn't entertained any Canadian funding prior to this film, but I felt like American Promise sort of gave us enough weight as filmmakers to be able to engage with the National Film Board of Canada. And like I said, the Trinidadian Canadian Leah Marin, who's in Toronto, really loved the story. And then my co-producer, Jennifer Holness, who's Jamaican Canadian, came on board as well, and we kind of took this journey, together. And yeah, so that's kind of the background to that.
And what you were making, like throughout your career as a filmmaker, what's the craziest thing that's happened to you, like in terms of experiences that you've had?
Oh my God. I have to say, some of the harrowing stuff that happened in the Dominican Republic with the undercover cameras, where I really felt very responsible for, the main participants who were in the film and who were actually wearing the undercover cameras on their bodies, going into government office spaces and confronting the checkpoints with the military, was for me very harrowing. I think there was another moment for me. My very first feature was called Faces of Change, and there were short films about racism in different parts of the world. And I was actually in Mauritania looking at the anti-slavery movement, because slavery still exists in Mauritania and other parts of Western Africa. And we were stopped a few times and had, our tapes were almost confiscated. There was just myself and another female DP at the time, and we had a whole system of sending out. This was back in the day when we were doing mini DV tapes. It wasn't digital. We were, we were mailing out, the material that we were shooting every other day, so it didn't stay with us because it was fraught with security issues. There was an attempted coup before, a few weeks before we arrived. And so there were a couple of very harrowing moments where some of our material was actually, confiscated, and we had to sort of make some, we had to prove, who we were. So I think that's what stands out in terms of, I was probably a little, crazy to do it, but those were important stories to be told. And there's still issues there in Mauritania, but I think that they're, I like to think that, highlighting some of these stories provided greater awareness. American Promise wasn't easy either. I think that our American Promise, some of the more harrowing stuff was more personal, around really having this personal dilemma for myself between being a parent and a filmmaker. When did I keep my parent hat on, and when did the filmmaker hat, come off, so I could, really pay attention to my son and what he was going through. And there were some really, difficult moments for me trying to figure that out. But I think that ultimately the camera became a tool that helped us unpack many things that we might not have done otherwise. So that was interesting. That was an interesting process of thinking about it from a perspective of ethics and parenting. What does it mean to have the camera, in this space for us and for our child? So those were more kind of personal questions that came up on a regular basis for us.
And through the different projects that you've done, for example, like Stateless, do you rely on your background as a human rights lawyer? Is it something that comes into play a lot when you are planning a project, or even while you're filming?
I think I think what it does, I think it comes into play more in terms of the stories that I pick. I'm kind of, I guess, I'm drawn more to these questions of, racial inequity, and what do questions of race and color look like in our communities? I guess that comes from that kind of training. I did a lot of, when I was studying, I did a lot of work around critical race theory, which is probably, if I were to stay, I probably would, end up being a professor teaching those things, but as opposed to staying in practice. And not so much on the ground. I think on the ground, it's interesting. What happens there is more psychological, and it's more about kind of emotional connection. And that, I think, really comes from some of the, I have to say, the lived experience of living with a psychiatrist, who's also a filmmaker. Joe, my partner, who's my life partner as well as my creative partner, has taught me a lot around interview techniques and how do you go deeper to get to a point of vulnerability and trust with the participants that we work with. And I think that is key to having meaningful stories. You have to get to that point of vulnerability and trust, where you can really gems can be expressed from the participants, and can, it also in some ways can even become therapeutic for them. We've done some short series pieces with I don't know if you know the music festival called Afropunk. They have a series of they have their festival. They have one in France, South Africa, and Brooklyn, and they're just starting their video component platform. And we just did a series of pieces around the tenets that they have, anti-discrimination tenets. And those were just straight on interviews that we did with people around different issues. And we spent some time that I think our skill set about really being able to reach a point of vulnerability in the dialogue allows us as audiences to more immediately relate with the experience, you know, and kind of see ourselves reflected. And so that's more of what I'm thinking about, you know, when I'm on the ground, when it's not logistical, because sometimes you have all kinds of hats that you're wearing that have to do with that. And then the other aspect for me that's gaining more and more importance is the visual, you know, cinema of it. You know, how cinematic can we make this? What are the visuals that we can really explore that make a statement, that make a visual statement?
Yeah.
Oh, the thing that I wanted to talk about, I realized from before, coming from that Haitian diasporic perspective and looking at stateless, you know, and I think that, again, that is a very particular baggage for me that I bring in terms of my own ancestry, that I'm not sure somebody from another point of view, coming from a different space, would necessarily think about. But for me, making the connection between the massacre of 1937 and what the folks are experiencing now, and what Rosa Iris is doing, was really important to understand the cycle of violence, and something that I know that I was familiar with. For those who don't know, in 1937, the massacre was declared by the then dictator Trujillo, who sent his military near the border to basically chop the heads of, you know, people of Haitian descent and Dominicans who were Black at the time, who were dark-skinned. Sometimes the massacre happened so quickly that they didn't even make the distinction. And actually October is the commemoration of that. It happened on October 2nd, 1937. And we still don't know how many people have died. They say somewhere between 10 and 20,000. And it's one of the acts of extermination in the Americas that has not really taken the space that it is. And there are unmarked graves along the border that we don't know of. And I interviewed, you know, some people in their 90s, on both sides, who were part of families who had actually hidden some of their Haitian friends and people who worked for them. And, you know, Dominicans of Haitian descent who fled to the other side of the border and refused to go back out of fear of the terror that had happened. And I actually interviewed people who were forced to dig the unmarked graves and put the bodies in. And so for me, it was important to mark that cycle. And so we have that legend in the film of Moraime, who is a young, the spirit of one of the people who were murdered. And she comes back to kind of protect the children of the area. So that is one thing, that is the layer that I think, you know, comes from the experience of you know, that being our ancestral land, you know, and marking that and knowing that we have to tell our stories, because part of our history sometimes is denied, you know, and that we must make space for that history in order for us to heal as well.
I think that's really, I love this. It's really, really important. I think it's something that comes back very often in conversations with filmmakers, also the role of film in helping us to heal. The power of film, the power of storytelling as a medium of healing, just the fact of being able to tell your story, being able to tell it in the way that you want to tell it, the way that you see, the way that you feel it. It sort of helps you to piece together this puzzle that is yours, that's your history, and, you know, plays a big part in healing, which is why it's so important for us to, you know, why documentary is so important for us in the Caribbean. And, you know, before, when people would talk about documentary, it would be, you know, usually connotated to something that's pretty boring, a bit tedious, on topics that, you know, nobody really wants to hear about. Now, documentary is like really exciting, you know, even though now, when people talk about documentary, sometimes they have in mind like sort of like these news investigative pieces, or, you know, like very informative, or they think maybe National Geographic or that kind of thing, where the scope of documentary is like so broad. There's so many different ways that you can tell stories. There's so much space to experiment and to play. So I think, as you say, like we are at like a turning point in like our history and the things that we can do, the resources that we have to do them. So I think it's like absolutely amazing. Just a last question before we wrap up. If you had to give like one piece of advice to like early filmmakers who like just starting off, from your experience as a filmmaker, what would be like the thing that you would pick that's, maybe now that you wish that you'd known before, or that you learned along the way and that you think is like really valuable?
Yeah, I mean, I've learned so much along the way. There's so many things that I've learned. I think there's a combination of things. So, on the practical side of things, I think, while I feel on the practical side of things, I think, you know, um, you know, I probably would have tried to pick a craft, whether it's photography, cinematography, or editing, that could keep me in the space of storytelling, because directing is very hard to do at the beginning, but you can always get some work around editing or shooting or being an assistant camera that kind of keeps you in that space, and you learn as you go through, and with your vision of eventually being your own filmmaker. I think, if I had to, not that, being a lawyer certainly helped open doors for me. The first film I had that was funded by somebody, who I met through law school, who was now working at a foundation, at the Ford Foundation. And it was through that law school connection that I was able to get funding. But in terms of the skill set and being able to work more in that space, I probably would have tried to refine one of those skills more so, although I have shot myself. But I think on the more sort of broader sort of vision aspect of it, I think understanding that this is, and I said this earlier, that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint, and trying to be patient with myself in the process, and being very intentional about engaging in growth mindset. I think one of the hardest things, because I teach people in college now who are in film school, and I think some of the hardest parts that I feel at that age that happens is being able to separate your person from the critique.
Mm-hmm.
That often we take critique very personally and we become defensive about what we're making. And I think that being able to learn how to accept critique, but then pick what you're going to choose to pursue in terms of the feedback that you get, but understanding that it's about the work. It's about the work and making the work better. But that takes a lot of practice. I get very, I still get touchy when I show something and then I hear feedback and I was like, okay, this is not about me. It's about how people are perceiving it. Because at the same time, as much as film and nonfiction film and storytelling is about putting our vision out there, it's also a very collaborative process. And we want to make sure that we're communicating to others what we're trying to, express. So it's having that balance. So, and that takes time, to decipher which critiques make sense for us. And being patient with ourselves, giving ourselves that space to be patient but determined, right? Patience but determined. If there's a story you want to tell, understand that it may not get told, in a year or 2 years. It may take 5 years. The average independent film here in the United States that's independently financed and pursued, it takes 5 years to make. So understanding that there is a longer journey, but that if you invest in the journey and the process, you will have moments of satisfaction along the way also. So being patient with yourself around that.
I take that advice to heart. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I had a great time. I enjoyed this.